Her book, Learning to Mentor as Praxis, Foundations for a Curriculum in Teacher Education, published in 2010 by Springer, offers a new conceptualization of the discursive character of mentoring. She is a member of editorial boards of leading journals, such as Teaching and Teacher Education, and Teachers and Teaching's Theory of Practice. Lily, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Juanjo. Buenos días, Salamanca. I'm not going to go on in Spanish, but I'm honored to be here, and I want to thank ISATT for inviting me. It's a pleasure. It's a wonderful city. And I was telling you yesterday, some of you, that this is not fair. This is after the dinner, yesterday, the gala dinner. So I hope that you are not asleep. I'll try to keep you awake and challenge each other as we go. And Juanjo, un abrazo grande. Thank you. Okay. Up. So let's get started. This is my topic for today. I'm going to try to map the field of teacher-mentored learning at the workplace, what we know and what we don't know. In a recent article published by educational researcher in 2014, Philip Dawson argued that more than 3 decades of mentoring research has yet to converge on a unifying definition of mentoring. I think that the lack of common definition grows out of the diversity of relationships that are classified in mentoring. For example, mentoring student teachers in higher education does not speak the same language as mentoring student teachers at schools, or as mentoring novices or experienced teachers at the workplace. I even found that we're dealing with different journals and publishing in different journals, and that's very interesting. So there's basically potential confusion in the field, and it is reflected in the different terms conveying the same idea or similar ideas. For example, when we talk about the recipient of mentoring, very often we talk about mentees, very often we talk about interns, student teachers, novice teachers, protégés, so on and so forth. Not to say that they are the same, but they share lots of characteristics, and it's very interesting to see how the field has been using different terminology, and I would even say inventing different terms for something that is, I think, more generic and more core. So, to make the story more complex, I think that mentoring, if we go back to the roots of mentoring in Homer's characterization, we already have the dual function of the mentor then. On the one hand, we have the matriarchal function, including roles of caring, emotional support, and nurturing. That's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, the patriarchal function, which speaks to a narrative of maturing into manhood, reinforcing the ethos of the patriarchic public sphere, and the mentor always as navigating and balancing between opposing, yet I would say complementing competing functions called for when taken over, in Homer, family and public roles during Odysseus' absence. So it's a real complex issue, and we have been trying to understand that, myself in particular, for the past, I would say, 2 decades. So my role here, I thought, would be, in Spanish you say, hacer orden, to make some order. And therefore, my purpose is to try to map the terrain of mentoring and mentor learning through 3 different domains or areas that, in my opinion, are nowadays a bit, I would say, you were talking about disruption yesterday, Yuka and Jean. I wouldn't say disrupted, but rather fragmented in the way we're looking at them. One of them has to do with the different conceptual models of professional learning and mentor professional learning that have been, that we have been presenting and been exposed to over the past 3 decades. That's one bit of the literature. The other bit of the literature has to do with the empirical study of mentoring and mentored learning and the research studies that have been conducted both in pre-service and in-service education. And then this is what I'm going to add to the narrative, recently the study of methodologies of mediation. In other words, how do we mediate learning more from nowadays a more sociocultural perspective, and what do we know about that? So my claim is that these three areas are rather dealt with separately, and I wondered whether there were some links or some connections between the three in order to think about a more coherent body of knowledge that we can pursue and move forward with. As we go, I'm also going to talk about the challenges that the study of mentoring and the field of mentoring poses as we look at these three areas. So this is the presentation. What we know. I'm going to talk a bit about conceptual models of mentoring as they play out in the literature, the study of mentoring, methodologies, and then I'm going to go a bit more in depth as to what we don't know. That's the interesting bit as far as I'm concerned. What do we still not know about it? And I want to talk a bit about methodological challenges, curricular challenges, conceptual challenges, and the last one, which is the most interesting to me, is how do you mediate the right moment in practice? I think that's a very big challenge for all of us in teacher education. Okay, so examining mentoring through what we know lenses. I'm going to go into conceptual models and then into empirical studies on mentoring. So, conceptual models of mentoring have been conceptualized, or models of mentoring have been conceptualized in many papers. I'm citing you, Juanjo, and Tony, where are you? I don't know if the rest of the people are here. You presented a very interesting paper on three different models of mentoring in practice. I'm going to go a bit differently and try to present a synthesis of the different approaches to mentoring as they play out in what I call this personal growth approach, the strategic approach, the situated approach, and the critical approach. And here I'm going to draw on a study, on a review that we just submitted with Yan Wang from Texas Tech. We tried to look at the models and try to find a framework that would synthesize what we know about the conceptualization of mentoring around three areas. One area has to do with connecting teacher learning to mentor learning and mentoring. So how does the personal approach, for example, play out in terms of its assumptions about teacher learning, in terms of teacher mentoring focuses and practices that pertain to these assumptions, and in terms of the type of outcomes that we want to look at when we are trying to mentor by this approach taken to the extreme, okay? So I have some of the keywords in red so that you can, it's a very crowded kind of slide, but I think that there are several things here that, that are important to mention. If we are thinking about models of mentoring that go by a personal approach, then the assumptions about teacher learning have to do very much with initial concerns of personal growth, motivational beliefs about teaching and how they shape students' ability to plan, organize, and carry out teaching activities. By the way, not just student teachers, but also in-service teachers. So the main idea here would be the personal growth and development of the teacher as mediated by the mentor. Teacher mentoring that goes by this approach would really put emphasis much more on personal problems, on autonomy, on historicity, and where the mentee is at. I think that narrative research would go in here as well. What are the narratives and the life stories of teachers, and how do they play out in the way they understand teachers are learning? And the outcomes are really what we're interested in. The mentor in that relationship would be to the professional development and growth of, and satisfaction maybe, of the mentee. But I'm not going to go into depth into each of these because this is not the point of the presentation. Just to go by the situated approach, which is mostly about craft knowledge, contextualization, and you know all of this, apprenticeship of observation, a variety of teaching settings, and mostly mentoring would focus on models of exemplary teaching, articulating thoughts in the here and now event, in other words, the situatedness of the event and of the teaching-learning interaction is the important thing. And the learning outcomes that we might expect from such an approach taken to the extreme again is the development of teaching practices and experiences necessary for improving student learning in the context of their teaching, student teaching and teachers. This is an interesting one. The strategic approach assumes that teacher learning can be transferred from context to context. It's interesting how it's gradually developed, and I'll show you our conceptualization of that in the idea of what Pam Grossman and her team call nowadays decomposing practice. And you've probably heard of that, how you take a core practice, you decompose it, you represent it, and you reinterpret it in the here and now event to be transferred to other situations. So, as opposed to the situated approach, learning can be transferred from context to context. There are models of core teaching for teachers. The practices have to do with decomposing such moments of teaching and demonstrating the value and the norms that they generate. The outcome of teacher learning through this approach would be the development of core teaching practices, and that's a big narrative nowadays everywhere. In Israel, we have this big narrative between core practices and, you know, different practices that would play out for different types of contexts. So, that's the fourth one, and the fifth one is the critical approach, which is more situated within the sociocultural arena, where we're talking about adopting a critical stance towards teaching, systematic and collaborative action research, raising problems of teaching, co-thinking and co-learning, and exposing teachers to alternative visions. This is the whole issue of agency. Jean was talking about that, Yuka was talking about that yesterday, the whole idea of the transformation of the teacher. Now, one of the things we do in that article is we don't just lay out those four approaches, but we try to think about them critically in order to arrive at and focusing on the challenges that each of these approaches poses and the problems when taken to the extreme. So I'm just going to read to you a piece of our conclusion to wrap up the first part of the models and come up with some insights on that. So, teacher mentoring in service of teachers' learning, conceptual basis, characteristics, and challenges for teacher reform. Broadly speaking, we're basically asking the same WH questions: how people learn, how they learn, why they learn, what they learn, where they learn, and who they learn with. But we're giving different answers according to each approach. Elaborating on the challenges in that article that each approach faces, we argue that teacher mentoring really has to bring all these approaches together. That's not, you know, there's nothing new under the sun in terms of what we've just said. The only problem is that we need to have a more coherent model of mentoring that takes from each of these approaches in a way that it addresses the particular needs or the particular context or the particular processes and events happening at a particular time. So, for example, in conceptualizing such goals of pre-service teacher mentoring, it is necessary to integrate the personal needs and problems that pre-teacher service have and encounter in learning to teach as considered by the personal growth approach, for example, or the craft and contextualized knowledge of teaching effective for student-teachers learning as valued by the situated approach, and so on and so forth. So basically, if we look at these approaches, and we try to make some sense about how do we look at them in interaction, or one as complementing the other rather than being distinct from the other. Still though, a review of the literature shows, in general, a very interesting and almost obvious, I would say, shift when we look at theories of professional learning and how they relate to mentoring practices and to conceptualizations and models. So, whereas at the 30, 40 years ago, we were talking mostly about transmitting knowledge and strategic views and behavioral cognitive psychology view, and we know all that. Nowadays, we are using more the term mediation of knowledge, which draws on sociocultural theories and cultural psychology. So we are moving little by little, if not fast. The pendulum is going back and forth in terms of how these approaches might be seen through a lens of mediating knowledge, not disregarding them, but looking at them in a way that we can integrate them within our practice. So, if I think about where the field is in terms of models of mentoring, then we can say that we are kind of in between worlds. On the one hand, we're looking at the importance of apprenticeship, at the importance of modeling and representing best practices, and decomposing mentoring practices and the impact of mentoring on teaching. In other words, this is the big piece that we have to deal with. And I'll talk about it in a moment. How does mentoring affect teaching, and how does teaching affect learning? So this is one bit. Then the other bit has to do with acknowledging contradictions and tensions and complexities in the situated event, discrepancies between ideological, political, and moral stances, pedagogical reasoning, and actions that play out. This is the practical kind of perspective on mentoring, which brings all these together in the mentoring interaction. And the notion that professional learning is not anymore a staged, linear process, but a very messy construct that we should attend to. So the interesting bit about the conceptualizations of models, and I have only quoted a few people who have, scholars who have dealt with the field. I think that we are kind of in between worlds, and there's a need to put this together in a different framework that addresses both worlds. Okay, that's the bit related to the conceptual bit on models of mentoring. I'd like to go to the second part, which is what we know about the study of mentoring. And here I'm going to draw very briefly on a review that I conducted in 2016 in the International Handbook of Teacher Education, edited by John Lugran and Marilyn Hamilton, which unfolds the development in the field of mentoring and reviews and synthesizes the studies of 3 decades of research on mentoring in teacher education in order to identify trends, passages, and shifts in pre-service and in-service education. This is the review, just to give you a gist. We went on 3 online databases. We had criteria for inclusion of which articles and which studies would go in. And we had selected education databases, identified 426 articles published between 1990 and 2014. I don't have the spread of countries, but we have something like, I would say, 40 different countries. I have it, but I didn't bring it to this presentation. Something like 40 to 50 countries dealing with the topic of mentoring in different studies. We we did thematic and content analysis, and there was factual data and descriptive data. You can see the categories. And this is what we have, okay? This is the first bit of interim stage of, I mean, we have already the findings to do with the different thematic aspects. So one of those is the mentoring roles and functions. And when we look at the literature, we see that in the studies, there's a lot of talk about forms of support, the place of context in mentors' roles, student-teachers' perceptions of mentors' roles. The second category, the number of articles that were published in that area. Mentor pedagogy, performance and skills. I'll talk about each of them in a minute a bit. Mentoring conversations, that's a big piece that nowadays is becoming more and more trendy and into the discourse of mentoring. And mentoring through technology, which is also, there's also not too many studies, by the way, but it's an issue. Outcomes of mentored learning, 73 studies, but the interesting bit about these studies is that they don't, many of them, there's still a big void in the arena of outcomes of learning. In other words, what does mentoring do to the mentee and to the pupils in the class? So there's some talk about it, some writing. There's quite some writing about the processes that enhance mentees' learning, and here again, I'm drawing on Tony's work on enhancing mentees' learning in the practicum settings, and the reflective bit, how modes of reflection and different aspects of reflection play out, conditions that support mentees' learning, professional learning and knowledge development, 61 articles. This is the mentor's knowledge bit, which is also a big thing now in mentoring. Context for mentoring preparation and development, that's also something that many studies deal with. Context policy and programs, and mentoring relationships. For some reason, I would have expected these to be to have more of these, but these were the least, although there's a lot of writing on emotional support, managing conflicts and barriers, relationships, and mediation. Altogether, this is what you get. And just looking at that data and trying to trace some shifts in the literature in terms of the themes, I don't know if you can see the small, it's the same themes that you had in the previous one. I'm going to read them to you now. Early 90s onward, there's a lot of writing on mentoring strategies, on practical skills, assessing mentored learning, observing and supervising. Notice the wording, the use of language, which is kind of very depictive of the area. Formal and informal context of assistance and collaboration, and the notion of dyadic interactions, which nowadays we talk much more about collaborative and group interactions, and very, the notion of mentoring as a dyadic interaction has kind of, been taken to the background of the discourse. The mid-90s onward, lots of writing about collaborative professional learning, the issue of trust and culturally sensitive relationships. That's a bit I'm very interested in, coming from a country with so many cross-cultural and political frictions, and mentees and mentors from different cultures and different backgrounds working together, engaging in team and co-teaching, the notion of co-teaching and coaching, again, with a different type of view, creating partnerships, and subject matter dialogue. This is interesting because subject matter dialogue at some point was put aside, and it's now been brought back to the arena even today, although in a different way, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And the last decade of research, The last decade of research really deals with issues which are very, very interesting and still I would say, under-analyzed and under-theorized. We have a lot of work to do on that. Ethical and moral considerations, even the use of advanced technology within those ethical arenas. Formal processes of preparation for mentors. Are we talking about a profession, a semi-profession? What are some of the criteria that we want to instantiate and formalize in the program? And issues of diversity and cultural sensitivity. Okay, so just the gist of some of the going more in depth into some of these themes. Okay, the notion of the role of the mentor as the diagnostic function of the mentor comes very, very often. The notion of framing novices learning in the sense that you are trying to you're trying to help the novice understand what it is that he or she is doing within a particular domain. It's the naming also of what he or she is doing. And models of thinking about different methods of teaching. I think that's a big issue in roles and functions. Amanda has done work on tensions in teachings from a different perspective, but still relating to this idea of framing through tensions and learning relationships by Sean Bullock. Again, a call to reframe my pedagogy in the study of teacher education. Forms of support. This is also an interesting one. Here I would like to quote a bit more in depth the work of Sharon Feeman-Nemser and Norman on the idea of identifying tensions between theory and practice in the mentoring interaction. The notion of mind and activity in teaching and mentoring. How does mind and activity, I'm sorry about this, it came down for some reason, but how do you work out what the student teacher is thinking about and what you're doing at that moment? Tony talks about making explicit the cultural milieu that shapes advisory practice. That's an interesting aspect of how you articulate what it is, what the cultural background or the cultural milieu shapes or informs the way in which you advise or give advice in certain contexts. And there's the issue of encouraging dilemmas and providing solutions. So you have the solutions on the one hand, but also the idea of what I call dilemmatic conversation. These are some studies on mentor knowledge, which is also a big issue. And this is taken from a piece that I wrote quite a few years ago, and I was really taken by this. The mentee would say, I wish she could share with me what goes on in her head when. I think that's a bit which is really, really fascinating. The sharing with me what goes on in her head. And I think this is an aspect that we should be looking at much more in depth when we're talking about mentor knowledge, the articulation of that. More exposure to unsafe situations, that's also an interesting bit. And taking me through her process of decision making. How do you decide what you decide? Take me through that process. Here is some work by Pauline, by Ali Toom on experiences. I think the research-based approach does a lot of that, in the sense that while researching your practice, you're trying to get into these aspects. And the idea of eliciting experienced teachers' practices, Pauline, in your work, has to do a lot with that as well. Okay, outcomes. What do we know about outcomes in mentoring? We know that there's the notion of what I call theoretical knowledge particular to a practice. In other words, there's an arena that we need to go more in depth into, and that is when you're doing practice, when you're practicing, what is that theoretical knowledge that emerges only from your practice? It is not the theory-practice divide. It is that conceptual bit that you can only get and understand when you are practicing. So I think this is the outcome, what you call the grounded theory in action, that is not the theoretical knowledge that we're learning. We know that there's a lot of integration in action, multiple settings, multiple perspectives and skills, and in other words, we expect outcomes to be of this type, of multiple perspectives, of multiple settings, because reality is multiple. A big challenge is to know how we assess and evaluate those multiple outcomes, and what are those multiple outcomes that we can define for ourselves. In terms of context of practice, this is what we know. We know that in practice, there's a lot of what I call simultaneous and contextual thinking, connecting settings, persons, and actions, thinking through cases, identifying and establishing a professional space within the practice setting or at the workplace, establishing norms of professional collegial conduct. This has not been dealt with that much in mentoring, and managing multiple skills simultaneously. That calls for a different body of knowledge in practice that we need to tap and understand better. In other words, it is not the discrete skills or I would say, the transfer of theory into practice or practice into theory. It is a completely different domain, what goes on in the here and now event. What do we know about programs and structures of practice? We know about the importance of creating contexts of practicums that allow for experimenting in conditions, and this is interesting, at low risk, but with the right dose of challenge and support, and that are authentically complex. That's a good way of putting it. And I think Tom Russell has done a lot of work on that. The idea of the authentically complex learning in practice, and the reflective piece that goes in the action itself. I think that as far as programs and practicum settings are concerned, these are very pertinent questions, such as what do student teachers reflect upon, what precipitates reflection, and what factors enhance the work by Tony again, factors that enhance or constrain reflection, and the nature and substance of cooperating teacher reflection in practicum settings. In other words, the stress has been on the reflection that goes on in the practicum settings. I would say reflection for action and reflection on action. I want to put the piece of reflection in action on the table so that we can think about it and see what is that and what are we looking at. Okay. The third piece I want to share with you is the piece that has to do with the shift towards a more sociocultural view of mentoring beyond transmission, which is the mediation bit, and share with you, some of the ideas that are on the floor nowadays. The interaction whereby the mentor of the expert professional selects and frames experiences which are authentically relevant and deal with relevant problems, the sequencing, the surfacing, the analyzing, and the encouraging reflections on emergent gaps, and I'm stressing the word gaps, and new connections and modification. The whole arena of mediation, now we're talking a lot about mediation of professional learning and trying to understand what does that entail. This is a more cognitivist perspective within a sociocultural setting, still a lot to do in that arena. And the notion that Anne Edwards has put forward of relational agency in mentoring, which I found particularly interesting, the expert and the learning working alongside each other, expanding interpretations of responding to children as learners, and mentoring conversations that encourage the potential agency of student teachers and help them connect their sense-making with publicly validated meaning. There's a whole issue of, on the one hand, a cognitivist perspective, but that is very much embedded within the sociocultural and even going to families. And her pieces in Jean's and Yuka's Handbook of Research on Teacher Education, and I truly think there's a lot to be learned from that notion. Okay, so if we try to put together what we know about mediation in practice, basically this is what we know. We know at the level of talking about, I would say, that mediation has to do with all these things going on together when you're in the interaction between mentor and mentee. You're dealing with ideas, with ideologies, with discourses, with teaching subject matter, theory and practice, values and people. All that go together in the here and now moment. And that makes it very, very complex. So the big question is, if this is what we should be doing, this was my question 2 years ago, what should we be looking at that is in the field that tries to mediate, tools that try to mediate professional learning? And one of the things that interested me in particular was the whole notion of methodologies of mediation. In other words, using Cole's framework of artifacts and tools more from a socio-activity theory and sociocultural perspective, how do those tools and artifacts play out as methodologies for the mediation of professional learning? So, in this review, in the book, Methodologies of Mediation of Professional Learning, which has just come out, I tried to, together with my co-author, Ditsa Maskit from Gordon College of Education in Israel, we tried to look at methodologies as forms of expression and inquiry into experience and do a review the same way I had the review for the mentoring bit on the study. What has been done in the arena of the 9 primary artifacts that we use all the time in our teaching and in our teacher education programs as mentors? So we map these as methodologies, forms of expression, as primary artifacts, talking about how each of these might be a form of expression within the context, but I'm not going to go into that in depth. I just want to, these are the 9 methodologies that we looked at. Story, visual text, cases, video, simulations, portfolio, lesson study, action research, and info ICT. Now, what's the interesting bit? Doing a very comprehensive review of the 3 decades of research and work on these methodologies that we have all been writing about, I'm just going to share with you what we found because it also connects to the previous arena. This was the question that really interested us. What distinguishes one methodology from the other? What distinctive features of professional learning does a particular methodology promote? In other words, we've got so many methodologies on the field. How are they different from one another? Who might benefit most from a particular methodology in terms of population, stage of professional development, novices, experienced teachers, or student teachers? And this is what we found. We found that basically there's lots of methodologies going on in the field. There's a recognized need to adapt different methodologies of mediation. That's on the front. But there's no explicit distinction when we look at them through our analytical framework of the population or context that each methodology might best serve. What I want to say is that the weak links, this is what I call the weak links in the study of the what of methodologies of mediation, is that the outcomes of all 9 methodologies of mediation are exactly the same. So when you look at articles and you look at the findings and the implications and the applications, you find exactly the same. So it's very difficult to distinguish when we're doing the analysis between, for example, lesson study or video in terms of what is reported about student-teacher learning or even pupil learning. And these are the things that the recurrent themes of these methodologies, same type of outcomes. So my emergent insert is, you know this, right? This is from the movie. Are you talking to me, man? It seems that methodologies are not talking to each other. In other words, I mean, are talking or not talking, because the outcomes are very similar. And the big question is, when we look at conceptual models of professional mentoring, the study of mentoring and mentored learning, and the study of methodologies of mediation, we find that there is a need to reconnect. In other words, this is what we need. There are 3 different fields outside there: conceptual field, empirical field, and empirical field of mediation, and they don't seem to be talking to each other that much, not even within the methodologies of mediation. So it's inter and intra. So basically, we have a very fragmented picture of what is going on in the field. What are the challenges? I have time? What are the challenges? And here I'd like to suggest 3 different types of challenges: methodological challenges, curricular challenges, and conceptual challenges. Methodological challenges. I think one of our biggest methodological challenges is to try to establish multi-layered analytical frameworks to attend to connections between context, process, and outcomes. If we once thought that we have to divide them up and look at each of them separately, I think it's about time that we try to put these together. And the analytical frameworks that we're using nowadays are not enough. What I mean by that is that we need to be looking much more at analytical frameworks such as CDA, critical discourse analysis, cultural historical activity theory, looking at discursive analytical lenses in order to identify discursive components of professional knowledge and activity. And the most important bit, I think, or the most not important, the most intriguing one, has to do with how these connect to the larger historical group of participants' practice. A very intriguing arena here is, for example, how the mentor's disciplinary background affects the way in which he or she understands the practice and mediates the practice. A mentor of history, if we go back to the historical roots of the discipline, this is what Ayelet Becher found in her study, would think about the mediation process in a different way than a math subject matter mentor. There are some similarities, but there are also distinctiveness, and I think we should be paying attention to those. And quoting Sleater, 2015, which seems to align with what I'm saying, there are not sufficiently large-scale studies to suggest the impact is not too ideal. She's talking about research policy practice. Idiosyncratic use of quantitative and qualitative data to enable policymakers to see how a program or practice might interface with local realities. Attending to connections, to tensions and connections. These are the curricular challenges between mentoring at the workplace and instructional frameworks at the university. Continuity, transcending thinking about what to do and what strategies to adopt, and the view of learning that spans throughout the continuum of time. Yeah, the work of Maria here is very relevant, experiences and contexts. And here again, how cultural codes affect particular pedagogical actions, as in the work of Tony and Juanjo, and Stephanie's work on pedagogies of the practical as they play out in teaching behaviors and they change while moving from class to class, which is something that I know Stephanie is very much into nowadays. Other conceptual challenges have to do with the notion of teacher learning not as opposed, but together with or along with teacher education. We seem to be talking a lot about teacher education, and I think we need to start thinking about teacher learning as a focus. Not that they're contradictory, but we need to think about the learning. Here, the work of Cheryl Craig on her stuff of how school supports agency and connects to learning in different contexts is very relevant to how the novice interprets and understands her practice and the interventions that go on that might impede or enhance her understanding. And I think that one of the bits that we are dealing with in my country is the idea of context-sensitive conceptualization of teacher learning. In other words, how the school context characteristics such as the climate, the socioeconomic profile, the institutional and human resources on new teachers' learning strategies and trajectories affect their learning. So we are focusing much more now in terms of mentoring and forms of support, not just on the mentor, but on the whole. New challenges. I think that a very interesting challenge is the question of, and I'm going to read just, how does a practice become reconfigured or transformed from one context to another and over time? Do we remain fixed in our methodologies and in our practices? How do they change over time? And here, I'm connecting to the work of Meyer on the questions about the new ways of working and learning. In other words, we're in an era of new forms of learning and working. How do we address the different changes and adaptations as related to that? And Frances is now looking at pupils' best learning practices, and I think that's a very, very interesting and innovative way of looking at how we understand teacher learning, looking at pupils' best learning practices to inform teacher education best practices, in the sense that if we were thinking about, up to now, saying, okay, we're doing mentoring, how does mentoring affect teacher learning, and how does teacher learning affect pupil learning? That's the linear. Think that looking at it the other way around, identifying cases of pupils' best practices and trying to understand those best practices and what were the conditions and what was the type of teaching or mediation that led to those best practices in order to understand and identify how mentors and how we should be conceptualizing teacher learning in our curriculum in higher education. It's kind of going the other way around. And I thought, as we were talking with Frances, that was a particularly interesting way of looking at it. Okay, one more minute? How much? 8 minutes. Oh, good. So, if we look at conceptual challenges in the study of mentoring, we might want to think about juxtaposing different research lenses to address core issues, such as, for example, how evidence on case studies as providing a mirror into professional experiences, which are some of the outcomes, connect or disconnect with evidence on the potential of simulations as a methodology, for example, for representing professional experiences in an interactive context without real-life pressure. In other words, talking to each other, the case and the simulation, in order to see what is that new idea that or what can we learn from putting these two together. Or evidence on how action research, on the role of action research in changing teachers' views about the role of theory in teaching, and evidence on lesson study as connecting between theoretical understandings and lived experience. These are dealt with, but I think we need a much more juxtaposing of the different methodologies. So towards an integrative agenda, we might want to think of conceptual challenges such as connecting between evidence from descriptions of mentors' thinking processes, the whole arena of identity formation on the one hand, and evidence from mentors' performance and behavior. How do these two play out together, and what is the shared arena? Or the effects of program context on mentors' performance, or mentor learning and pupils' learning in class, or role formation and knowledge and communicative skills acquisition. There are many more. I'm just, sharing with you some of these ideas, or skills that mentoring programs promote, and policy standards, the whole arena of policy. And this is the last bit. So, up to now, the emergent is that these two, the learning for practice and the learning on and from practice, which is what I have spoken about until now, need to talk to each other, both research-wise and conceptually. But I think the big question mark that is left out there in the open is the learning in practice bit. And here again, I think that one of the most intriguing aspects of when looking at the terrain that has been left for us to explore is the idea of understanding critical moments of learning in action in the authentic here and now context of practice. For example, when to ask the right kind of question. How does the student teacher or the teacher know how to ask the right kind of question at the particular point in time? When to put or in other arenas like in medicine, when to put your hand on a patient's shoulder, or what I call the clinical mode of now or never in professional thinking and deliberation. And I'm just going to give you now 3 pieces just to trigger your thinking about other professions in which they are thinking about that in interesting ways. For example, in medicine, some of you probably know about this book because I have presented it in other contexts. But for those of you who don't know, Atul Gawande, in his book, Complications, A Surgeon's Notes on an Imperfect Science, writes about physicians learning in practice as a kind of conscious learning which becomes unconscious knowledge, and the most interesting bit is that you cannot say precisely how. It is that tacit that cannot be articulated, that in medicine, even if we think about medicine as a very structured body of knowledge, there's still that bit which is what makes you become an expert, which cannot be articulated in the traditional mode of reflection. In nursing, Michael Lantley, who is a philosopher of education at Warwick, writes about what do nurses know, and this article was published in Tate a long time ago. What we can think about is not only restricted to what we can describe. As when a nurse is bandaging a patient and you're asking her, how did you do the bandage? It is very difficult for him or her to say how he or she did it, because these are things that you do in action that are very hard to articulate and explain to others in traditional ways. Same thing with cognitive psychology. The group, Perkins group, nowadays is working on the idea of good judgment, which requires a combination, and this is new in the area, of inclination, sensitivity, and ability. These are ideas that we have to start thinking about in teacher education in order to do this kind of mediation, which I spoke about before. So, to end with, I'm leaving you with a question. What does it take for a moment of appropriate or inappropriate judgment to become a moment of knowing? I think that's the most interesting question, for me at least, as a researcher in the study of mentoring and mentored learning, and in the study of teacher learning. I think that the work that we have done on traveling pedagogies, many of you have chapters in this book, and Cheryl and I have co-edited these books, begin telling us what is being done in those appropriate or inappropriate moments, and I think we're very challenged to go one step further to put them in action and see what is really going on and how these travel and differ in terms of assisting students and teachers. And this is the end. I thought this could kind of end up the idea of education, which isn't how much you have committed to memory or even how much you know. This is Anatoly Franzi, but how it's being able to differentiate between what you know and what you don't know. And I think that's what makes us want to do more research and keep asking questions. Thank you very much.